more prolonged spells of wet weather. And it's a similar story for Northern Ireland, with plenty of showers around this lunchtime, the heaviest of which are likely towards Armagh and down. Temperatures here around 14 Celsius. So staying very unsettled for the rest of today, with further showers or longer spells of rain, and generally cooler than on Sunday. And that's how your weather is shaping up for the rest of the Monday.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually. That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now this morning we look ahead to a busy week in Westminster with the long-awaited Sue Gray report and more allegations of sexual impropriety among MPs. Also today, what can Australia's election tell us about the trends in Westminster? And how can politicians stop wasting all of our money? All that to come after this morning's headlines.
A very good morning. It's 9:32. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date on GB News. A health worker has been arrested on suspicion of poisoning a child. The child died at Birmingham Children's Hospital on Thursday. The 27-year-old has since been released pending further inquiries and has been suspended by the hospital. West Midlands Police say the child's family is being supported by specifically trained officers. The Prime Minister is facing calls to explain why he held a meeting with Sue Gray ahead of her report into lockdown parties at Downing Street and Whitehall. About 30 people, including Boris Johnson, have been contacted by the Cabinet Office to warn them of the contents of the document, which also reportedly includes photos. A review into children's services has warned thousands more will end up in care unless there's a radical reset of the system in England. The independent review of children's social care is calling for a £2.6 billion sum of investment over the next 4 years to prevent crisis intervention. Among 80 recommendations, they're suggesting a windfall tax should be imposed on the profits made by the largest private children's home providers. 2 football fans have been charged after crowds stormed the pitch at Manchester's City Premier League game against Aston Villa yesterday. Villa goalkeeper Robin Olsen was hit in the head after his team's defeat at the stadium. The government's advising people who are at high risk of catching monkeypox to isolate for 21 days. 20 cases have been identified in the UK. The UK Health Security Agency says anyone who's had direct exposure with a confirmed case shouldn't travel, should avoid pregnant women and children and the immunosuppressed. The health agency is also advising they get a smallpox vaccine. On your TV, online and DAB Plus radio. This is GB News. Now let's head back to Tom for the briefing.
Good morning, it's 9:34 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and on your radio. Now, last week in Westminster was a difficult one for the Tories, with calls for a culture change within Parliament. The slow slew of sleazy stories has so far resulted in 2 by-elections to be held on the 23rd of June. By-elections the Tories could well lose. And of course, it's Sue Gray week. Will the Partygate saga finally be put to bed by her long-awaited report? Or could it simply reopen old wounds? There's a lot to discuss, and who better to talk through it than the chief political commentator at The Independent, John Rentoul. Welcome to the programme, John. I suppose the Tories are glad that all of this Partygate stuff is finally coming to a close, but potentially that might not be a lot of relief depending on what's in this report.
Well, absolutely. Then it'd be, I don't know what's in the report. I'm looking forward to reading it. So far, I'm puzzled by some of the decisions that the police have taken, and I think the police ought to explain themselves on grounds of accountability and transparency. They ought to explain why, for example, Rishi Sunak got a penalty notice for turning up 10 minutes early for a meeting, and why Simon Case, who was the cabinet secretary, who was also at that birthday party, didn't get a penalty notice. Perhaps Sue Gray will help to explain that, because she might actually give an account of what actually happened when Boris Johnson was presented with a birthday cake. I mean, perhaps there was perhaps they were dancing on the cabinet table, or there was a Marilyn Monroe impersonator jumping out of the cake out of the Tupperware. I don't know. I mean, there's something that's not quite right about what we know so far about that event.
Big issue with this whole story is that we seem like we're so familiar with it. It's been plastered on so many pages of various newspapers for the past 6 months. All of these different events, which we all refer to as parties, although some of them seem more jovial than others, seem to all merge together. I suppose we'll get that moment of clarity, but also perhaps some photographs, which might well be the most important part of the whole saga.
Well, will they? I mean, they're not going to change anything, because the police have already decided who broke the law and who didn't. And I don't think that Sue Gray can contradict them and say that, certain people should have been fined for other events. Certainly not just on the basis of photos. I mean, on the photos, we've had a bit of spin from Number 10 this morning, suggesting that they're quite happy to have some of the photos published, because they'll reveal quite how sober and unparty-like some of these gatherings were. But no, I mean, we're all looking forward to a jolly good read, but it's not actually going to change anything, I suspect.
One of the rows that developed over this weekend, of course, is who called a meeting between the Prime Minister and Sue Gray. Of course, Sue Gray's investigation is supposed to be independent. There's supposed to be no political interference. And of course, I don't think many people are doubting the very great level of respect that everyone has for Sue Gray. And yet there is a bit of confusion over this meeting. Can you help clear it up for us?
No. Well, I can help in the sense that I can say it really doesn't matter. I mean, this is what Alistair Campbell used to call processology. I mean, it just does tend to obsess journalists sometimes. It really does. It's irrelevant who called, whose idea the meeting was. I mean, it's just the fact of the meeting doesn't look great, because, as you say, that would be an opportunity for the Prime Minister to put pressure on Sue Gray. Although I'm sure he wouldn't have done anything quite so crude. And she is perfectly capable of resisting that pressure. And presumably they were discussing when the report was going to be published and what kind of report it was going to be, just so that the Prime Minister would know what he was responding to. But no, I mean, it's not an independent report in the sense that Sue Gray is inquiring into the behaviour of her colleagues and her boss. So it's never properly independent. But as you say, everyone has a great deal of respect for Sue Gray and thinks that she will reach the conclusions that she intends to reach, and will not be swayed by straightforward political pressure.
Well, I would hate for this entire conversation to be just about Sue Gray, because it feels like we've been having this conversation for such a long time now. We also have 2 by-elections coming up next month. The Tories have selected their candidates for those by-elections in 2 very different parts of the country, one up in the Red Wall in Wakefield and one down in the southwest, Lib Dem facing seat. Are the Tories going to lose them?
Yes. I thought you were being extremely generous in suggesting that there was any doubt about that. I remember when the government losing a by-election in the midterm to the Liberal Democrats in particular was described as a sensation. What would be a sensation in both of these cases would be if the government managed to hold on to either of these seats. The Lib Dems have shown that they're perfectly capable of winning seats such as Tiverton and Honiton, which was a Leave voting seat. You wouldn't have thought Lib Dems would be capable of winning those, but they won Shropshire North. And Wakefield is essentially a Labour seat, which the Conservatives gained last time, but they've fallen back since. And in the local elections, Labour won all the wards that make up that constituency.
It's incredible that these by-elections have been coming in thick and fast off the back of this sort of new Pestminster set of revelations. There could well be some more. It seems like the Tories won quite a big majority, but it seems to be slipping away at quite a significant rate.
Well, I think the majority will still survive for the full parliamentary term, which is probably only going to be 4.5 years, because we'll be having an election in May 2024, I think. I mean, that seems the most likely date, although it could go as late as January 2025, now that the Fixed Term Parliaments Act has been abolished. No, I think the majority will survive. I think it's the working majority is down to 75 or something now, so it will go down to 71 if those 2 seats are lost. I think there's enough scope for Boris Johnson.
I think probably the bigger implication is, of course, people worrying about their seats and therefore not wanting to vote with the government quite so much. I'm afraid we've run to the end of the conversation there, John, but thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight, and honestly, it's such a pleasure to have straight answers to straight questions. I've never had a politician on the show who answers with just a simple yes or no to questions before, so no, thanks for joining me. Cheers. Well, moving on now to on Saturday over the weekend, of course, Australians went to the polls, booting out Scott Morrison, the former Australian Prime Minister, and installing the country's first Labour Prime Minister in almost a decade. Anthony Albanese, as some might say, was sworn in as the country's new Prime Minister this morning. But it's still a few seats short of a majority as things stand. That's the Australian Labour Party, of course. This election was particularly interesting because of the close parallels to our politics here in the United Kingdom. Famously, political strategists swap between Australian and British politics with ease. The Tories so often rely on the so-called Wizard of Oz, Linton Crosby, to run their campaigns. Indeed, working on the defeated Liberal Party's campaign this year was one of the architects of Boris Johnson's 2019 landslide victory, Isaac Levido. And on the Labour side of things, John McTernan, the former Director of Political Operations to Tony Blair, went on to become the Communications Director to Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard. So what can Britain learn from the Australian election? Well, I'm delighted to be joined now in the studio by John McTernan himself. Welcome to the programme, and I suppose congratulations to your party for winning in Australia. How did they do it?
Look, they did it by being very, very small target. They had a few number of policies. They promised only a few things, but they offered a fresh start. And what they offered a fresh start on was climate. That, for me, is the defining question of this last election. I was out in Australia a couple of weeks ago, and the Labour Party were not having a razzmatazz election. They're having a very careful, very safe one, because they lost an election 3 years ago, which they thought they'd win. And it was the Independents and the Greens taking seats from the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, losing inner urban voters, professional women voters, on the issue of climate change. So what you saw is it was a country deciding it needed change and using the Labour Party as the instrument to achieve that change, which feels to me very similar to the mood in our country at the moment.
There are remarkable parallels. The Liberals, as you rightly say, the sort of Conservatives, the classical Liberals to some extent, in Australia have been in power since 2013.
Yep.
The Conservatives in the United Kingdom have been in power since 2010. That's sort of around about a decade for each party. And indeed, there is this sort of change in voting patterns. The Liberals in Australia holding on to what we might define as red wall type seats, but losing the urban, professional, well-to-do areas. Is there a lesson there for the Tories, particularly with these Lib Dem facing seats?
Well, I think you're exactly right there. The Australian Liberals have had no positive discrimination for women candidates in their party. As a consequence, women just left the party. They didn't just leave the party, they left the party and became independents and stood against them. So if you don't accommodate women within your politics, there's now 2 million female professionals at work in Australia. That's more than the combined number of tradies, the working class voters that have been fought over so much in recent elections. So I think you've got a sense of an educated, professional, feminised electorate, and you've got the political parties, particularly Liberals, fighting over the voters they won from the Labour Party. And actually, they didn't make any progress in the coal seats in the Hunter Valley, the coal seats in New South Wales. So even some of the working class vote has come to Labour and not to the Liberal Democrats, the Liberal Party, not the Liberal Democrats. And I think it is a warning for the Tories about the blue wall, or a warning for the Tories about what I would call the sea wall, all the seats along the coast, the southern coast from Dover all the way to Cornwall, all of which I'd say, which are Tory held at the moment, are under threat. And that's because the changing nature of the electors, the demands they make. And if you don't meet what the voters want, whether it's on climate or whether it's on cost of living, you'll get chucked out. And it doesn't matter if you say the other guys aren't any good. The voters don't care. They're chucking you out because you're the government. They judge your record.
And it's so interesting looking at that Australian Labour campaign. Pretty muted, pretty quiet, not particularly razzmatazz. I mean, there are many parallels we could make with Sir Keir Starmer, who sort of seems to be a bit of a blank slate most of the time, but maybe that's all he needs to do. The Labour Party in Australia not advancing by a huge degree, but the Liberals falling back, particularly because of some of these teal independents, these women candidates who defeated what used to be notionally safe Liberal seats. I mean, could the Labour Party here just about stand still and allow the Lib Dems to do all their work, taking the seats off the Tories? Or are there not so many parallels in that sense, because the Labour Party does need to advance by a greater degree in Britain than it did in Australia?
Well, I think Albo, the leader of the Australian Labour Party, that's what we call him, not Anthony Albanese, we call him Albo. Albo showed really how to project himself as a leader. You simply let people know a few facts about yourself. You know, you're brought up in a council house, brought up by a single mum. People knew who his rugby team were. He just projected a sense of ordinariness around 2 or 3 facts. Keir needs to do that. Just need to let people understand 2 or 3 things about him. You know, he supports Arsenal, which is a shame, but, you know, like, he's an ordinary guy. He plays five-a-side. He plays pretty well. You get those things about yourself across, and then, exactly, you open yourself out to being usable to give the government a lesson. And if people want to, in the seats in the home counties, if they want to vote Lib Dem, I reckon that the big move of people, I know many young professionals, Labour voters in London, they've moved to St Albans, to Hertfordshire, other places. I reckon they'll just vote whoever can beat the Conservative Party this time round. And that is the feeling that Australia had when I was there a couple of weeks ago. People would do anything to get rid of the government. Now, climate was the mobilising element, and the fact that there is a safe space for Conservative voters to move to, which isn't as far as the Labour Party. It was created in Australian politics by the Teals, as you call them, the green-leaning blue candidates. But it's there already in British politics with the Lib Dems. So I think the fragmenting landscape, the difficulty of any party in the UK getting over 40% of the vote, the return of the Lib Dems, it suggests to me that we're going to see an election very similar to the Australian election, but with our first-past-the-post system, just as majorities are magnified, you were talking about the 80-seat majority earlier on, so are defeats. Defeats have been magnified. So you could see a very big defeat. And the Liberals in Australia, Labour are looking to get across the line by picking up 4 or 5 more seats. The Liberal Party lost 20 seats. Huge defeat for them. That's why Scott Morrison resigned.
And of course, it's a much smaller legislature. So,
yes,
so
150.
The equivalent would be a lot more.
Yeah, the equivalent would be 4 times as many. So losing 80 seats.
Wow.
And that's Labour needs to gain 100 seats to get to 300. But that now looks
sort of almost
prospect.
achievable. The parallels are quite remarkable. It's interesting to see how sort of our politics are swinging in the same sort of direction, although not uniformly, but but often. But John McTurnan, thank you so much for talking us through that fascinating election results. It's been a really, really interesting discussion. Cheers. Now, moving on to another issue. Of course, we touched on it briefly with those by-elections. The former Conservative MP Imran Khan is due to be sentenced this afternoon after being found guilty of sexually abusing a teenage boy in 2008. He was expelled from the party within hours of his conviction and later resigned from Parliament, triggering that by-election in Wakefield to be held next month, of course. I've been exploring the background to this case. Let's take a listen.
I'm here because I'm standing for Parliament.
For a while, Imran Khan appeared to be the potential darling of the Conservative Party. He was a committed Brexiteer, the grandson of a miner, a father born in India. He seemed to represent a new conservatism, one at ease with modern Britain. He was Wakefield born and bred, and in 2019 finally managed to defeat that constituency's long-standing Remainer MP Mary Cray.
Great to be back. Great to start the campaign.
The seat had been Labour-controlled since 1932.
I will do it again, but I'll do anything for the constituents of Wakefield.
Morning, sir. Morning, sir. But last year, Khan was charged with a historic sexual offence, accused of groping a 15-year-old boy in 2008. The victim said he'd felt scared and vulnerable as Khan forced him to drink, watch pornography, and then attacked him. The jury decided he was guilty.
Following his conviction, it took around 3 weeks for Khan to finally submit his letter of resignation. It's thought that he collected his MP salary in full for the month of April. But for many here in Westminster, the real scandal is the culture within the buildings behind me, the seemingly endless stream of sexual assault allegations, and ultimately the character of those whom we elect.
Amazingly, despite his crime, Khan was supported by a fellow Tory MP, triggering a fresh row. Former committee chairman Crispin Blunt later said he'd step down at the next election.
I do think that in every walk of life you will come across people whose behaviour is not what you would expect, it's not appropriate, and it doesn't just live in Westminster, in other businesses as well. But it's what we do about it, and unfortunately we've seen a slew of complaints being made against sitting members of Parliament and no real plan as to how we're going to protect the people that are working there.
Mr. Khan has no comment.
Since Khan's conviction, a string of new claims have emerged about the conduct of other MPs.
Any word for your victim, Mr. Khan?
Yet more exasperated questions about how to fix Westminster's rotten culture. Tom Harwood, GB News.
And we're expecting the sentencing of that case this afternoon. Well, moving on, the government is failing to buy from small businesses and start-up companies as it's wasting taxpayers' money by spending too much on underperforming public services. That's according to a new report from the Entrepreneurs Network think tank. The report suggests that the government isn't giving start-ups a chance by forcing them to meet unnecessarily gold-plated standards. And the Minister for Government Efficiency and Brexit Opportunities, Jacob Rees-Mogg, has endorsed this report, urging the government to not be frightened of start-ups and innovation. So, what are politicians spending our money on, and could it be spent a lot better? I'm delighted to say that joining me in the studio now is Sam Dimitrescu, the research director at the Entrepreneurs Network. This report seems to, I suppose it could be criticised by many in terms of saying, shouldn't our government services be gold-plated? Shouldn't the standards be incredibly high?
I think the issue is that we have public sector buyers who are overly risk averse. They're too afraid to fail. So actually what we want is we want public servants who maybe they'll waste a few £1 million here or there, but overall they'll take chances on innovative startups and they'll actually deliver better public services, more technologically enabled public services. I think the issue is sometimes the requirements completely don't match what they're doing, you know. You might be running a small training service for civil servants and you might be required to have unlimited liability insurance, and that's essentially tips the thing from being a project that's worthwhile for you to do to a project that's no longer a real profit maker and it's just about breaking even.
So all of these tight regulations on how the government can interact with businesses basically means that the only people who can afford to do business with the government are the big established players rather than the small startups.
Yeah, and that creates a big risk, as we saw with the failure of Carillion. If you have big companies with many public sector procurement contracts all at once, what can happen is if they go bust or if something goes wrong, then that can have knock-on effects across the whole public sector. Now, there are lots of different ways we throw up barriers. So one is the sort of excessive gold-plated standards. Another is a failure to advertise standards in a timely manner and a failure to let people know when procurement contracts are coming up again. Now, big companies, they can have a specialist team and literally they will know when the next contract for cleaning services in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy will come up. They know for a fact when that is. A small company who could probably provide the same service will not be able to do that. They won't have a member of staff looking at that.
I suppose they don't have the big compliance departments and everything else. And I suppose this goes beyond just government services. It goes to the whole attitude towards regulation as a whole. So often the biggest companies are those that actually advocate in favour of big onerous regulation, in favour of barriers to entry for other competitors. And we get this sort of crony capitalist state where only the biggest set the rules and exclude everyone else.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think these things can sort of happen by accident. You know, everyone will say, OK, we need to make sure that no one fails. And you've got these incentives, right? If you're a politician, a junior minister, or if even you're a public sector manager and you're in charge of a contract, you don't really get rewarded if you take a risk on a company and it turns out well. You do get absolutely raked over the coals if something goes wrong. So as a result, they're overly risk averse. And what that means is you end up with these contracts that only go to the big companies. You know, the saying, nobody got fired for buying from IBM. And that's the problem across the public sector at the moment.
And yet, if ministers were to take more risks, there would be some services that didn't work out so well. Surely that's how do you account for that problem?
I think you have to be proportional to what you're doing. You know, you might not want to take a big risk on ambulance services. You might be very happy to take a risk on police uniforms.
I see. No, that's a very clear distinction there. We are running to the end of the conversation, though. So, Sam, Dimitri, thank you so much for talking us through that important issue there. And let's hope that there are some government ministers who can take that on. Jacob Rees-Mogg endorsing that report. Very interesting. Well, that's it for the show today. Coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick Christie's. But first, here's the weather forecast.
Looking ahead to today's weather, and the UK is looking rather cloudy for many, with rain in southeast England and showers elsewhere, especially further west. Let's take a look at the details. Well, quite a lot of showers developing across southwest England by lunchtime, perhaps merging in more general wet weather for a time, feeling quite cool in the rain there. Some wet weather also pushing into southeast England, albeit with an uncertain westward extent, and areas to the west of London may remain mostly dry. Much of Wales will see increasing amounts of showers as we move into the afternoon. These will be slow-moving and will likely be heavy at times. Perhaps fewer showers at lunchtime across the Midlands, but skies will often be rather cloudy. And if it is dry where you are now, showers are more likely in the